weight loss tips are really to start from a place of kindness to yourself. And I say that because having directed a weight management program for 15 years, what I've seen is that people get incredibly frustrated. It's a challenging process, and people can get really down on themselves because ultimately there are a lot of factors outside of our control that go into maintaining our body weight. And so while there's lots of things we can do to address our body weight, it's important to start from a place of compassion and kindness to yourself. And so from that place, once you start looking at making healthy lifestyle choices and start moving in the direction of a healthier diet, more exercise, better sleep, and other factors that affect weight, then in many cases the weight does tend to start to take care of itself. I always tell my patients that no two people lose weight at the same rate. Everybody is very different, and not everybody falls out to the same point. So the end point is different for two different people. And there is a real phenomenon where you get to a point where you've lost weight and it does become harder to lose weight. And that's not anyone's particular fault or a lack of willpower, it's just biology. And so it's important to be realistic about where you're going with it and not to be hard on yourself or to minimize the shame you might feel if you slip up, because again, everybody's human. So what I often will tell patients when they come to see me who are trying to lose weight is that I'd like very much not to actually focus on the number on the scale. In fact, I have patients when they come to see me who we don't even check a body weight, because that can actually frustrate people more if it's not going as quickly as they would like, or if it's even going in the wrong direction. And to focus instead on tracking the actual behavior changes that you're making, because that is something that you're more in control over. You're not in control of how quickly your weight changes. And so that strategy I found to be very useful for people, because I want you to focus on things that are really tangible that you're doing. And finally, my last tip would really be not to rely on willpower. So we know that willpower extinguishes I always say, by about 1 p.m. So it's not really a good long-term strategy for weight loss to rely on denying yourself and willpower and trying to white-knuckle yourself through a dietary plan. What I think is actually much more important is to change your environment. And that looks like changing the foods that you just happen to have in your home, working with whoever you live with to help strategize with you, having a partner who's working with you on this, a friend or a significant other, changing your routine so that, for example, if you know that you have a habit of walking by a certain bakery every day and getting that donut, that's a habit that it would be better just to walk on a different block so that you're not tempted to do that. Because again, willpower is just, we're all human, and you're gonna make those choices if you make it easier for yourself. There is some advice that's out there in the mainstream about weight loss that is really quite dubious. And I think that one of the ones that I hear quite a bit is that avoiding carbohydrates. That's probably the most common one. And on the one hand, I can kind of understand why people would say that, because there are many carbohydrate-rich foods that are not healthy for us and that are very dense in calories, and that if you make it easy to overeat calories, so that if you eat a lot of them, it will be very hard to lose weight and you probably will gain weight. And these are foods like white flour foods, crackers, cookies, junk foods, foods with added sugar, desserts. These, of course, are foods that nobody thinks is good for you. I mean, it's wonderful if you decide to mostly eliminate those foods from your diet. But that's what people are talking about when they're talking about carbs. Unfortunately, then what happens is that people lump that into all foods that contain carbohydrates. So they start thinking, well, then I shouldn't have a sweet potato, or I shouldn't have oatmeal, or I shouldn't have brown rice, or I shouldn't have fruit. That's the one that I think strikes me as the most crazy, because these are all foods that when people eat them as part of staples of their diet, these people who eat this way tend to have the healthiest body weights overall, and they've never been shown to cause weight gain over time. Unlike the highly processed carbs. So I think it's really important to separate out those types of carbohydrates. And in fact, I never use nutrient terms when giving weight loss advice or any kind of nutrition advice, because it just gets confusing for people. If you talk about carbs, protein, and fat, I prefer to talk about the foods themselves that are beneficial. So healthy carbohydrate-rich foods like beans, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, of course, those are all extremely health-promoting and can promote a healthy body weight as well and should not really be avoided. Some other weight loss advice that I've heard that I think requires some correction is really advice around protein. So I think for a long time people have thought that the more protein that they ate, the more muscle they would gain and the leaner and fitter they would be. And that's a myth that persists to this day. And the reality is that there is some truth. We do definitely need to get our requirement of protein. There's a certain amount of protein that we all need to eat, and you need a little bit more if you're very athletic or very active. And in fact, if you're eating a diet that is low in calories, you also do need to focus on protein and make sure you're getting enough. But that said, just eating more protein does not magically turn us into bodybuilders and lean and fit athletes. Of course, that requires a lot more than just the protein in our diets. So I would say that protein is not necessarily something to overly focus on. You just make sure you're getting enough for your daily needs, and make sure you're getting it from a healthy place. Because protein, when it comes from animal sources, tends to be promotes more inflammation. It tends to come with unhealthy nutrients, such as saturated fats and heme iron and other things that can promote chronic disease. Whereas when you get your protein from plant sources, you kind of get the best of all worlds. You get the amino acids that you need, along with fiber, along with phytonutrients, along with vitamins and minerals that we need, and it tends to be anti-inflammatory. So that would be my advice around protein. And I would say that the third piece of weight loss advice, or one of the myths that I hear all the time, is that I can exercise my way out of an unhealthy diet, or I can just exercise my way to weight loss, period. Now, I will say that there are definitely some cases in which people can exercise tremendously and lose some weight if they're not increasing their calorie intake or matching their exercise needs. But for the vast majority of people, what the science shows is that exercise is not that helpful for weight loss. It's important, it's great for many other reasons, but it doesn't really help people lose weight. When it comes to weight loss, it's really much more about the diet and the foods that you choose. Now, when it comes to not regaining the weight back, in other words, maintaining the weight loss, then exercise does play a bigger role. And so it's great to get into the exercise habit early in your weight loss process, because it will help you along the way and help defend your new body weight that you reach. But it won't, in and of itself, be as a sole factor, be the reason that you lose weight for most people. Obesogenic environment refers to the current modern day context that we live in which the foods that are readily available to us and most convenient for us, and quite frankly, that we are biologically driven to crave, are all around us. So these are what we call the ultra-processed foods, foods that contain additives that are not actually found in nature, and they're engineered to be incredibly delicious and make us keep wanting to come back for more. The fact that the portion sizes have increased in most restaurants and in takeout, the fact that sugary beverages are everywhere. It is very, very hard, if you think about it, it is very, very hard to make the choice to eat a healthful diet. You really are swimming upstream. And so this is why it's never one individual's fault when they are struggling with their eating habits. This is really about a societal issue. And so this is why it's so important to look at your own home environment and work with your family and your friends and get some social support around eating a healthful diet and really building a routine and environment for yourself that involves healthier foods, because it's very challenging to make choices in an obesogenic environment without that support. There's a lot of lore in the health and wellness space, again, around carbohydrates, and people tend to lump together all kinds of foods that contain carbohydrates, not forgetting that some of the healthiest foods on earth contain a lot of carbohydrates and are great for us. The other things that I think that I see a lot are this perception that there's really one magic bullet. So if I wake up in the morning and I drink apple cider vinegar with water every morning, suddenly I'm going to get to the body weight that I crave. And unfortunately, if it were so easy, I think a lot of people would do it and be successful. But the reality is it's much more about what you do day in and day out for the long term. And that's another reason that I think that doing things that are quick fixes there are some quick fix diets out there where you can lose weight very quickly. But these tend to be diets where people regain the weight because it's just not sustainable. And when we're talking about weight loss, we really need to be talking about something that you can keep up for the rest of your life. We're not trying to get someone to get to a specific body weight very quickly and then maintain it. It's much more about working this into your life pattern so that it's a natural flow of what you're doing, and therefore you're more likely to actually keep the weight off long term. So my recommendation specifically for dietary changes for people who are interested in losing weight is really actually the same advice I give people who don't want to lose weight. It's the same advice I give people who are healthy and the people who are living with chronic illnesses and want to get healthier. And that's to eat a whole foods, plant-based diet. And what that really means is eliminating or primarily avoiding highly processed foods like white flour foods, added sugar, junk foods, and also reducing, ideally eliminating or reducing animal food. So you're really making your plate focus on foods like legumes and non-starchy vegetables, whole grains, fruits, nuts and seeds, and some of the fattier plant foods like avocado. Now, if you're doing that kind of strategy for weight loss, you may want to focus a little bit more on the non-starchy vegetables than the legumes. In fact, one of the strategies I think works really well is if you imagine your plate and divide it in half. About half of your plate should be non-starchy vegetables like leafy greens or cruciferous vegetables like broccoli or cauliflower or zucchini, peppers. And then a quarter of your plate would be a legume or tofu or tempeh, some kind of bean or lentil. And then another quarter of your plate would be a whole grain like brown rice or quinoa, barley, farro, some kind of grain like that. And that balance works really well for people who are trying to work towards weight management. And if you find that you want dessert afterwards, then that's a perfect time to have some fruit or whether it's berries or frozen banana turned into ice cream. Those are some really great strategies, I think, for weight loss. But it's the same advice that I give to people who are just want general nutrition advice. So this is a strategy that is high in fiber. It's very nutrient dense. And it's been associated not just with weight loss in many, many studies, but it's also, probably more importantly, been associated with reduction in chronic disease risk and even longevity. And that's why I picked this advice. So the data are very strong that eating a plant-based diet is associated with a healthier body weight and preventing weight gain over time. And we also have interventional studies showing that when people adopt a plant-based eating pattern, that they can successfully lose weight, and in many cases without being specifically told to count calories, which is an interesting feature. There are still a lot of other diets out there that can help people lose weight, so why should you choose a plant-based diet? Well, I would say that the reason I would recommend a plant-based diet is because we also have extremely strong data for overall health promotion. So for example, we know that from a very landmark study that was published a couple of years ago, that when women are divided into two groups and one is asked to follow sort of an average protein diet versus a high protein diet, and they lose the same amount of weight, those that eat a high animal protein diet, they actually still have all the metabolic disarray that they started with, despite having lost weight. So you do all this work to lose weight, and yet it's negated. You still have the same amount of insulin resistance and inflammation because you're consuming a high animal protein diet. So this is why I would recommend a plant-based diet specifically as a strategy, because you know it will help you lose weight in most cases, and it will also serve you for the long term. People transition to a plant-based diet in all kinds of different ways, but I think the key to success is, number one, do some planning and research and educate yourself about a healthy way to eat plant-based so that you're not just diving in without any knowledge. And we know that when people don't plan and they end up suddenly in a situation where there's no plant options around, that they're not gonna, they're gonna flounder and not know what to do. So planning is really key, and you also wanna feel good and you wanna take care of your health while you're doing it. So if you just go out there and don't educate yourself on what are some healthy strategies as far as plant-based goes, and making sure you're supplementing appropriately, namely primarily with vitamin B12, you may not feel well. And you may undereat calories, you may overeat calories. So planning and research are really important. Beyond that, I would say you can do this in a number of different ways. You can, if you feel like you want to go all out, once you've done your research and done some planning, you could do one of the 21-day kickstarts. And those are really fun because then you're just all in for 3 weeks, and people can see health changes really quickly. And it gets you, like, speed dials you into this new way of eating. And that's, some people are really, do really well with that. And then there are other people who, for many, many reasons, I would say this is probably the majority of people, who need to do it more slowly, and that's fine too. Just kind of know what you need and what your circumstances call for. I would also say that I've seen patients say, maybe I'm just gonna go with breakfast for the first couple of weeks and just work on building up a repertoire of breakfasts that don't contain animal products or highly processed foods, and build up a repertoire, and then move on to lunch, and then move on to dinner. That's one way. The other way I've seen people do it is, I'm going to work first on one type of food. So I'm going to eliminate dairy, and I'm going to substitute. I'm going to see what other, what non-dairy milks I like, and try to start experimenting and substituting that in. And once you've mastered that, you can go on to say, now I'm going to work on eliminating poultry from my diet. And I'm going to see how I can creatively play with other foods to substitute instead. So those are two different ways that I've seen people do it. So I think it is a good idea to be mindful of the density of calories of the foods that you're eating. And what I mean by that is, really, if you look at foods like whole fruits, vegetables and legumes, and even whole grains to an extent, and tubers like sweet potatoes, all of these foods tend to be less calorie dense than many animal foods, than the highly processed foods, where they can really pack a lot of calories into a small space by using white flour, by using sugars, by not having a lot of fiber in those foods. And they're also less dense in calories than, say, the healthy foods that are plant foods like nuts and seeds and avocado, and then foods like oils. So all of those oils are actually probably the most calorie dense food that you can eat. And so it's important to be mindful of that, because they usually don't make you feel full, and yet they contribute quite a bit of calories to your day. So what that really looks like in terms of practical advice is building your plate around veggies, fruits, whole grains, and beans. And if you choose to have dressings and sauces, just be mindful of how much you're putting on. If you're not meeting your weight loss goals, you should really think about how many calorie-dense foods you have in your diet first. And then this also translates into advice around liquid calories. So this is really critical for people trying to lose weight. And I would say one of the first things I would limit is the calories that you're putting into your body in liquid form. So that looks like foods like any kind of sweetened drink. It also looks like 100% juice. That is basically pouring fructose into your body, which has downstream effects in terms of your liver and your diabetes risk. And even foods like smoothies, I would say those are fine if you're using them as a replacement for a meal, but some smoothies can have a lot of calories depending on what you put in them, so just be mindful of how you're using those liquid calories. So there's actually a lot of great spots online if you just Google cooking oil free, and most of them have to do with roasting, techniques around sauteing with vegetable broth. There are air fryers that people can use where food can get really crispy without actually having to use oil at all. And I would say once that you get into the habit of eating foods without oils, most people get used to it and don't really miss it too much. And this is an important strategy, I think, if you are adopting a plant-based diet and you notice you're still consuming oils and sauces and dressings that contain oil and you're not losing weight. That's a reasonable place to look for the hidden calories. When it comes to sugars, those sugars are really added ubiquitously and all over the place. So again, they're hidden in breads, they're hidden in sauces, they're hidden all over the place. So probably the first place I would look is in your beverages, because companies can really pack a lot of added sugar into beverages, and try to get in the habit of getting those out of your routine. And one word of caution is I would not turn to the non-nutritive sweeteners, so the sweeteners that are 0 calories. I usually don't recommend those for a few reasons. One is that there is some emerging evidence that they may affect in a negative way our gut bacteria and the types of patterns that we have, and sort of move things in a more negative direction. But more realistically, the other thing that they do is that they keep you craving sweet foods, because many of them taste hundreds of times sweeter to your taste bud than sugar itself. And so I would say it's probably better to just break yourself cold from added sugars and just get used to foods that don't have sugars added. And then trust me, once you do that and you eat a piece of mango, it will taste so sweet to you. It will be like heaven. So there's a little bit of a light at the end of that tunnel. Salt's really important to think about, because even if you have normal blood pressure, for example, if you eat a high sodium diet, it does raise your risk for developing high blood pressure later in life. So you're not necessarily immune to getting high blood pressure if your blood pressure is normal now and you're eating salt. So it is a good thing for all of us to be careful with. And most salt comes in processed foods. In fact, there's a lot of sodium in typical breads. There's sodium in many, many sauces and in pre-prepared foods. So by cooking more at home, you have much more control about the salt that you add. And if you buy foods that are less processed and don't have salt added, that's a great place to start. And if you do buy foods like sauces and so forth, try to purchase the low sodium varieties. An example of a meal that would be great for weight loss would basically be I like to recommend structuring your meal around the plate. So half of the plate would be a non-starchy vegetables. Ideally, a lot of different colors. So you would have a leafy green, a dark leafy green. You'd have cauliflower. You'd have red pepper. You would have broccoli and so forth. So a mix of different colors on the non-starchy half of the plate. And then you might have some lentils, which are very high in protein and fiber and phytonutrients, and that might fill up a quarter of your plate. And then another quarter of your plate might be a food like quinoa, which is also obviously delicious and high in fiber and many phytonutrients as well. So this ratio of foods really lends itself to achieving a healthier body weight, because it's less dense in calories than if you were to fill up half the plate with the whole grain. Or half the plate with beans. It's really a very, very good ratio. And I always say, if you finish that whole plate and you still feel hungry, just try to wait 10 minutes, ideally 20 minutes. And if you're still hungry, serve yourself more of the non-starchy vegetables and the beans in that order. And you should not feel hungry. You should really feel satisfied. But that's an example of a meal I think would be really great. And of course, you'd have a glass of water with it, avoiding liquid calories. And you can kind of dress up your water you could put fruit in your water, you could put lemon in your water. And then for dessert, you might have additional fruit or frozen banana. So increasingly, there are quite a few physicians and healthcare practitioners who have not only heard of plant-based nutrition, but are actually excited about it. So more and more, I've found that other doctors that I talk to have heard about this approach and are interested and intrigued to learn more. But if you find that your doctor has never heard of it or is even skeptical, I would say it would be a good idea to come with a couple of articles that you could share with your physician to kind of go over the basics of a plant-based nutrition, something that's been peer-reviewed and scientifically published, but that's not too long, because they usually don't have a lot of time to read right there in the office. And so that would actually hopefully bridge them to understand a little bit more about why you're choosing this approach. And you can also say to your doctor, listen, this is something I've heard great things about. I've done my own research and I've taken the time to educate myself on how to do this healthfully, and I'd really like your support. I'd like to do this for, you can say 2 or 3 months, and I'd really like to see how this goes. And if you have any concerns along the way, let me know. It's really important to have a doctor that's on board with you, even if they don't understand completely. The diet itself, it's really important that they partner with you, because if you're taking medications especially, you may actually need to have your medications adjusted once you change your eating habits. Your blood pressure may go down, your blood sugar may go down, and so forth. So it's good to have your doctor partner with you. There are so many factors that contribute to our body weight. And it's not just the food that we eat. It's not just how much we exercise. It also has to do with our genetics, plays quite a big role. Our microbiome plays a role. The type of gut bacterial patterns that we have. Our mood plays a role. So whether you have been living with depression or anxiety or other health issues around the mood space, that can actually affect your eating habits quite a bit. Sleep is emerging as a huge player in terms of maintenance of body weight. There are very compelling data that when we are sleep deprived or we have fragmented sleep, that we make different food choices, that our appetites are different. And so, again, it is never any one individual's fault if they're living with overweight or obesity. There's so many things that go into it, and this is why it's so important that we as individuals have compassion for ourselves and compassion for other people who are living with obesity.